A desperate child's trembling voice reached a man who had spent his life shutting the world out. One wrong call connected a starving little girl to a billionaire with no reason to care, yet that single moment shattered his cold walls forever. But would he arrive in time to save her family, or was fate already too late? Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? And if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more emotional stories. The evening sky bled into hues of orange and crimson as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the nearly empty street where 6-year-old Olivia walked with her little sister Lily. Olivia's small hand clutched Lily's tightly, her own belly aching from hunger that had been gnawing at her for days, yet she tried to hide it behind forced courage because she knew she had to be strong for her younger sibling. Lily's steps grew weaker with every passing moment, her breaths shallow, her tiny lips pale, until suddenly, without warning, her frail body gave in and collapsed onto the cold, unforgiving pavement. The thud of her fall echoed in Olivia's ears like a cruel reminder of how powerless she was, and she dropped to her knees beside her sister, shaking her gently as panic tore through her chest. "Lily, wake up, please? Please don't do this to me," she cried, her tiny voice trembling, carrying a desperation that seemed far too heavy for a child of her age. Tears blurred her vision, and she brushed them away with dirty little hands as if wiping them fast enough could undo the nightmare unraveling before her. Around them, strangers walked past, some glancing but quickly turning away, others pretending not to notice, their indifference slicing Olivia's heart even deeper, because in her innocence, she still believed someone, anyone, would stop to help. Her sobs rose above the hum of traffic, but still no one came. With shaking fingers, she tucked a strand of her golden hair behind her ear and pressed her tiny hands on Lily's chest, as though her touch alone could bring life back. The world felt too big, too cruel, and far too silent for a child who had just realized her sister might slip away. Fear clawed at Olivia's throat until she could barely breathe, but she forced herself to think, forced herself to remember that somewhere, hidden in her pocket, was the one lifeline her mother had left behind. Her trembling hand reached for it, pulling out the old scratched phone that felt almost too heavy for her small grip. Her thumb brushed over its screen as if it were some kind of treasure chest holding the last chance to save Lily. She knew only one number, a sequence drilled into her memory by her mother long ago in case of emergencies, though Olivia never imagined she'd need it for something like this, never imagined her tiny world would tilt so suddenly into despair. Her fingers shook so violently she almost dropped the phone, her heart hammering so loud she could barely hear her own sobs, yet she pushed through the terror and pressed the digits. Each beep of the dialing tone echoed like thunder in her ears, her breath catching with every second that dragged by. She pressed the phone tightly to her ear, whispering prayers she wasn't even sure how to form, pleading in broken whispers for someone, anyone, to answer. For the briefest moment, she thought the call would go unanswered, thought she would lose her sister right there on the pavement, but she clutched Lily's limp hand tighter, whispering, "Hold on, please, just a little longer, I'll find help, I promise." The glow of the setting sun dimmed further, the shadows lengthened, and the world around her seemed to blur into nothing but her sister's still body, her own racing heart, and the fragile hope that the voice on the other end of the line might be the miracle she desperately needed. High above the glowing city skyline, in an office of glass and steel that seemed to float among the clouds, Ethan Cole sat alone behind a massive mahogany desk, his blue eyes fixed on the mountain of contracts spread before him, his pen moving with mechanical precision, every stroke a reminder of the empire he had built on discipline and cold calculation. Silence reigned in the room, broken only by the faint ticking of a designer clock on the wall, until suddenly the sharp vibration of his phone sliced through the stillness, startling him enough to look away from the numbers that normally consumed his life, and with a sigh of irritation he snatched up the device, pressing it to his ear with the same sternness he gave to any unwanted interruption. His voice clipped as he barked, "Hello? Who is this?" Expecting perhaps a secretary, a business partner, or yet another investor begging for his time. But instead there came a sound so foreign, so raw, that it stopped him in his tracks. A trembling child's voice, fragile as glass, cutting through the polished air of his office like a desperate cry from another world. "Please, sir. My sister won't wake up. She's so hungry. I don't know what to do." For a heartbeat, Ethan froze, his mind refusing to register the words, his brows furrowing into a frown as he leaned back in his leather chair, disbelief tightening his jaw, and in a voice cold with suspicion he muttered, "Is this a prank?" He had heard scams before, had endured calls from opportunists spinning sob stories, but what met his ears next was not deception, it was pure, unfiltered desperation, the kind of sobbing that only a child who had seen too much pain could make, the sound of Olivia's broken heart spilling through the receiver, and in that moment something shifted inside him, something buried deep beneath years of loneliness and walls he had built so high even he forgot what lived behind them. His chest tightened as he listened, fingers gripping the phone harder as her words cracked and faltered, her breaths shallow and shaky between sobs that sounded more like gasps for air than words. And though Ethan tried to steady himself, tried to remind his mind that this could be nothing more than a cruel trick, his heart betrayed him, shuddering against the armor he had worn for so long, whispering to him that no one could fabricate that kind of fear, that kind of pain, especially not a child, and before he could even stop himself, his gaze shifted to the window where the city lights glimmered like indifferent stars, and for the first time in years he found himself at a crossroads, torn between the safe detachment of his wealth and the haunting vulnerability of a child's plea that begged him to be more than a name on the tallest building in the skyline. Ethan stood frozen in his office, the phone still pressed against his ear, his tall frame silhouetted against the massive glass window that overlooked the endless sea of glittering city lights. Yet for the first time in years, he did not see his empire, he did not see the towers or the bridges or the bustling life below. He saw only the sound of a child's sobs etched into his chest, echoing through him with a force he had not felt since he was a boy, left alone in a cold house, forgotten by the people who were supposed to care. His knuckles whitened as he clutched the phone tighter, staring at his own reflection in the glass as though the man staring back was a stranger, a ruthless figure who had built walls of steel around himself, a man who had taught himself to never get involved in anyone's suffering because it was easier to call it weakness than to admit that sometimes he still longed to be rescued too. But tonight something cracked, something raw and undeniable broke through the careful armor he had carried for decades, and before he even realized what he was doing, his hand reached across the polished desk, sweeping aside a stack of contracts, his fingers closing around the cool metal of his car keys, the sound of them jingling in the silence of the office louder than any applause he had ever received, more powerful than any deal he had ever signed. Pressing the phone firmly to his ear, his voice dropped lower, steadier, as if he was speaking to more than just a child, as if he was making a vow to the universe itself. "Stay where you are, little one. I'm coming." On the opposite their end, there was a sharp inhale, a sound so fragile it pierced him deeper than he expected, and Olivia's tiny voice trembled like the flutter of wings caught in a storm, whispering through tears, "Please hurry, sir. I'm scared." The words lingered in the sterile air of his office like a plea written on his very skin, and Ethan felt a tightness in his throat that he hadn't felt in years, a heaviness in his chest that reminded him he was still human beneath the stone mask of a CEO. He turned swiftly, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor, the vast empty office behind him suddenly suffocating in its grandeur, each expensive detail mocking him with the truth that all his wealth meant nothing if he let two children suffer alone on a street while he turned away. He pushed through the glass doors with urgency, the night air rushing against him as though the city itself was watching to see what choice he would make. And for once he didn't hesitate, didn't calculate risk or image, didn't weigh cost or consequence. He simply moved with the instinct of a man whose heart had finally woken from its long slumber. His car, sleek and black, waited in the shadows like a beast ready to run, and as he slid behind the wheel and gripped the steering wheel, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the rearview mirror, eyes no longer cold but burning with something else, resolve, fear, and a faint trace of hope that perhaps saving this child and her sister might save something in him too. He started the engine, the roar filling the underground garage, and for the first time in his life, Ethan Cole wasn't driving toward a deal, a contract, or a boardroom. He was driving toward two little girls who had no one else in the world, and though he had no idea what he would find when he arrived, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he could not, would not, let them down. The rain came down harder as Ethan stepped out of his sleek black car. The city lights blurred through the curtain of water, and his expensive shoes splashed into puddles as he rushed forward, his heart thundering in his chest at the sight before him, for under the weak glow of the flickering street lamp stood the tiniest figure he had ever seen. Olivia, drenched from head to toe, golden strands of hair plastered to her cheeks, tiny arms wrapped around her sister's limp body, as if sheer will alone could keep her alive. And when she looked up at him with those wide, tear-glossed eyes and whispered with trembling relief, "Sir, you came." Something inside him cracked so deeply he nearly forgot to breathe, his carefully constructed walls of pride and indifference crumbling in the face of such raw innocence. He dropped to his knees without hesitation, not caring that his tailored suit was being ruined by the rain and mud, and gently reached for Lily, whose pale face and shallow breaths jolted him with fear he hadn't felt in years, the kind of fear that clawed at his chest like a reminder of everything fragile in life. And as he pressed the back of his hand to her cold cheek, he felt Olivia's small hand clutch at his sleeve as though anchoring him there, silently begging him not to leave them behind, her voice barely audible above the rain as she stammered, "She won't wake up, sir. I tried and tried, but she just won't open her eyes." Each word a dagger that pierced deeper than any corporate betrayal or boardroom war he had ever fought, and swallowing the tightness in his throat, Ethan whispered back, "You did well, Olivia. You've been so brave," his tone carrying a softness he didn't recognize as his own, before carefully sliding his arms under Lily's fragile body, lifting her as though she were made of glass, her weight far too light for a child her age, and Olivia followed close, clutching at the hem of his jacket, her little legs splashing in the puddles as she tried to keep up, her trust in him so absolute it made his chest ache with responsibility he had never known. And as thunder rolled in the distance, Ethan shielded Lily with his body, muttering, "Hold on, little one, just hold on for me," while Olivia kept glancing up at him with eyes that silently asked the question she didn't dare voice aloud, "Will you really save her?" His car loomed in the shadows, the headlights casting sharp beams across the wet street, and as he carried Lily closer, he caught sight of Olivia's trembling form struggling to match his pace. So without a second thought, he extended one hand down to her, gripping her tiny fingers with surprising gentleness, guiding her toward the warmth and safety waiting inside, and when they finally reached the car, Ethan carefully laid Lily across the back seat, pulling off his suit jacket to tuck around her frail body, while Olivia scrambled in beside her, refusing to let go of her sister's hand, and Ethan stood there for a moment, rain pelting down on him, staring at the two sisters huddled together, so vulnerable and yet so strong in their love, and for the first time in years he felt something real stir in his chest, a fire not of ambition or greed, but of fierce protectiveness, of an ache to make sure no harm ever touched them again, and as he slid into the driver's seat, glancing back to see Olivia's wide eyes watching his every move, he offered her a reassuring nod and whispered with quiet determination, "You're not alone anymore, I promise," before gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled urgency, pressing his foot down hard, and speeding through the rain-slick streets toward the one place he knew could bring Lily back. The hospital, the word echoing in his mind like a vow he had never spoken before, that tonight he would not be the man who turned away, tonight he would be the man who stayed. Ethan's sleek black car tore through the rain-soaked city streets like a streak of lightning, the wail of the storm outside drowned by the pounding of his heart, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, while in the back seat Olivia sat hunched over Lily's frail form, clutching her little sister's cold hand with desperation, whispering broken words of comfort, her small voice trembling with fear that wrapped itself around every corner of the car. Will she die?" she finally asked, her words slicing through the silence with a rawness that shattered Ethan's composure, and for the briefest moment his throat closed as memories of his own lonely childhood threatened to surface, but he steadied himself and forced out, "Not if I can help it," his tone low yet charged with a promise even he hadn't known he was capable of making. and as Olivia's eyes filled with tears, she clung to that single thread of hope as if it were a lifeline, while Ethan pressed harder on the accelerator, weaving through traffic with precision, horns blaring in protest. But he didn't care about rules or red lights anymore, only the fragile child slipping further away in the back seat. Raindrops lashed against the windshield, every flash of lightning illuminating Lily's pale face, making Ethan's pulse quicken with urgency, and he kept stealing glances in the rear-view mirror where Olivia's golden head was bent low, whispering, "Stay with me, Lily. Stay with me, please." Over and over, each plea cracking his hardened shell a little more. Finally, the glowing red sign of the hospital came into view like a beacon of salvation, and he swung the car violently into the emergency bay, tires screeching as he came to a halt, immediately flinging open his door and rushing to the back seat, where he scooped Lily into his arms once more, her weight terrifyingly light, her breath shallow and uneven, while Olivia scrambled out beside him, clutching at his coat as though afraid he might vanish. The sliding doors burst open and the sterile brightness of the hospital lobby swallowed them whole, where at once a nurse with kind eyes and a swift, authoritative voice appeared, Grace, her nun, aim stitched neatly on her uniform, who gasped at the sight of Lily and barked orders to the staff around her. "We need to get her stabilized, now!" Her voice commanding yet laced with compassion, and Ethan followed her every move, his chest heaving as if he were the one suffocating, unwilling to release Lily but knowing he must, his arms trembling as he finally handed the child over to the waiting team, watching helplessly as they rushed her onto a gurney and wheeled her toward the emergency ward. Olivia panicked at the sight of her sister being carried away, breaking free from Ethan's hand to run after them, her cries echoing through the sterile halls, "Don't leave her! Don't leave my Lily!" But Grace bent low to reassure her, her voice soft as a balm to the storm. "Sweetheart, we're not leaving her, we're saving her. Trust us." And those words, though gentle, didn't stop the tears that streamed down Olivia's face as she stumbled back toward Ethan, who knelt and pulled her close, wrapping her in arms she never expected would feel so safe, and as she sobbed against his soaked shirt, he found himself whispering over and over, "She'll be okay, Olivia, she'll be okay," though deep down he was terrified of what the doctors might say. Grace paused before disappearing into the emergency doors, her eyes locking with Ethan's for a heartbeat, silently reading the desperation on his face, and she gave him a small nod, a promise that they would fight for Lily with everything they had, before the heavy doors swung closed, leaving Ethan and Olivia in the waiting area, the hum of fluorescent lights above them, a cruel contrast to the storm raging outside and inside their hearts. And for the first time in his life Ethan felt utterly powerless, stripped of his fortune, his influence, his walls of steel, left only with the fragile hope that the tiny girl who had collapsed in the rain might still open her eyes again. The hours dragged on like an eternity, each tick of the clock in the starkly lit waiting room echoing louder than the storm that still raged outside, and Olivia sat curled in a chair too big for her tiny frame, her knees drawn to her chest, golden hair damp against her cheeks, eyes fixed on the heavy emergency doors as though staring hard enough might force them open to reveal her sister safe and smiling. Ethan sat beside her, a man who had faced down ruthless competitors, hostile takeovers, and million-dollar deals without ever flinching, yet now he felt utterly powerless, his hands restless on his knees, his breath uneven, his heart strangely tethered to the fragile child who leaned on him as if he were the only safe thing left in her world. And when she finally broke the silence, her small voice cracking like fragile glass, "Sir, why did you come? You don't even know us." He felt the weight of the question press against every scar he carried, every wall he had built, and for a long moment he couldn't answer, his throat tight, his mind racing with the truth he never spoke aloud, that for years he had ignored calls for help, brushed off pleas as distractions, told himself the world's suffering was not his burden. But tonight something had shifted, something about this child's desperate voice over the phone had pierced through all the layers of armor he wore, and so he forced himself to meet her wide, questioning eyes and confessed in a low, almost broken voice, "Because sometimes, we all need someone to come." The words tasting unfamiliar yet undeniably true, and Olivia blinked at him, her tears slowing as though she were trying to understand the depth of what he had said, her lips trembling as she whispered back, "I thought no one would." And those words hit him harder than any insult or rejection he had ever endured, because he saw himself in her loneliness, in the quiet despair of being left behind by a world too busy to care, and for the first time in years, he reached out instinctively, his large hand gently covering her tiny one, the gesture so simple yet carrying a promise stronger than contracts or wealth, and Olivia's small fingers curled around his as though she had been waiting her whole life for someone to hold on to. The minutes dragged into hours, nurses moving briskly past with clipboards and hushed conversations, every passing second stretching Ethan's nerves thinner, his mind torn between hope and dread, while Olivia's eyelids grew heavy, but she refused to sleep, whispering Lily's name now and then as if afraid her silence might erase her sister's existence. And Ethan, noticing the way her body sagged with exhaustion, slipped off his coat and draped it around her shoulders, watching her eyes flutter before she leaned against him, her warmth fragile but grounding, and he sat utterly still, as though any movement might break the fragile trust she had given him. He had spent his life surrounded by opulence, marble floors, glittering chandeliers, and voices that praised him for his wealth yet never cared for his soul. But here in this cold waiting room with a child leaning against him, he felt more human than he had in decades, stripped bare of power, clinging to hope like a beggar at the gates of mercy. Time blurred, and with each swing of the emergency doors his chest clenched, hoping it would be Grace with good news, dreading it might be someone with words that would shatter the fragile hope Olivia carried in her trembling heart. And at last Olivia whispered into the quiet, her voice so soft it might have been mistaken for a dream. "You won't leave us, will you?" A question that held more weight than any promise he had ever made, and he turned to her, eyes heavy with exhaustion but blazing with a sincerity he could no longer hide, and whispered back, "Not now, not ever," knowing in that moment he wasn't just speaking to her, but to himself, vowing that whatever the outcome, he would no longer turn away from the cries of those who needed him. The tense silence of the waiting room broke at last when the heavy ER doors swung open, and Grace stepped out, her white shoe gown squeaking softly against the sterile floor, her face lit not with the grave shadows Ethan had dreaded, but with a gentle, reassuring smile that seemed to flood the cold corridor with warmth. And as she met their anxious eyes, she spoke words that felt like sunlight piercing through storm clouds. "She's safe, weak from hunger, but she'll recover." And in that instant Olivia leapt from her chair with a cry that was half sob, half laughter, her little legs carrying her faster than Ethan had ever seen, her golden hair streaming behind her like a banner of relief as she raced down the hall after Grace, her tiny hand pushing the door open with determination that defied her age. And when she saw Lily lying there on the hospital bed, pale but breathing, eyes fluttering weakly as though fighting their way back to the world, Olivia stumbled forward, clutching her sister's hand with both of her own, pressing it to her cheek as tears spilled freely, her small voice breaking as she whispered, "Lily, it's me, I'm here, I never let go." Words soaked in devotion and relief, while Lily's lips parted in the faintest of smiles, her weak voice rasping, "Olivia, you stayed." And those two words sent Olivia into a storm of tears that wet her sister's hand. But this time, they were tears of joy, not despair, for she knew now that her sister had been pulled back from the edge. Ethan lingered in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the harsh fluorescent lights, and he felt something stir in him that he had thought long dead, something buried under years of cynicism and wealth-driven ambition, compassion, raw and disarming, clawing its way back into a heart that had been locked away behind steel walls. And as he watched the two sisters cling to each other like castaways reunited on shore, he realized with a sharp ache that money, power, and the empire he had built had never once filled the hollow space that this simple moment now touched. Grace busied herself checking Lily's vitals, adjusting IV lines and noting the improvements, her professional calm wrapping the room in security. But even she paused for a heartbeat to watch Olivia's devotion, a silent admiration shining in her kind eyes before she turned to Ethan and murmured softly, "She'll need time, food, care, but she's out of danger now, thanks to you." And though Ethan wanted to brush off the praise, claiming it was simply circumstance, he couldn't ignore the truth, that he had been given the choice to look away, and he hadn't, and that choice had changed everything. Olivia glanced back at him then, her tear-streaked face glowing with gratitude as she whispered through hiccuped breaths. "You saved her, sir. You really saved her." And though Ethan shook his head slightly, murmuring, "No, Olivia, you did, you never gave up," inside he felt something shift, the heavy chains of solitude loosening with each word, and as he stepped closer, drawn in by the fragile beauty of the scene, Lily's small eyes opened just enough to see him, her lips parting with a faint, almost inaudible whisper, "Thank you," and those two syllables broke the last defense around his heart, flooding him with a warmth so overwhelming it nearly brought him to his knees, for he realized that in saving her, they had also saved him. The next morning dawned with soft light pouring through the hospital windows, painting the sterile white walls with a golden glow that felt like hope made visible, and Ethan, who had not slept a single moment, stood tall yet weary by the door, watching as nurses moved quietly around the room, their voices low, while Olivia remained curled up at Lily's bedside, her small hand never letting go, her golden hair tangled but glowing in the morning light, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet filled with relief every time Lily stirred. Ethan had already spoken to Grace at length, his voice firm with a conviction that surprised even himself, insisting that no expense be spared, that every treatment, every comfort be provided, and when the final stack of hospital bills was presented, he didn't flinch, signing them away with the ease of a man for whom money had always been a tool. But this time the act was not about pride or image. It was about two little girls who had reminded him what it meant to be human, and as if that weren't enough, he made arrangements quietly through his staff for food, fresh clothes, and even a safe apartment where they would no longer have to sleep on cold streets or wonder where their next meal might come from. Still, amidst the quiet bustle, Olivia's small voice broke through, carrying the weight of every fear she had carried alone. "Will you leave us now?" she asked, her wide eyes brimming with uncertainty as she looked up at him from the chair beside Lily's bed, and the question struck Ethan harder than any deal gone wrong, because it revealed the deepest wound in her heart. Not hunger, not exhaustion, but the terror of abandonment, the fear that once again someone might appear only to vanish when they were needed most. And Ethan felt his throat tighten as he slowly sank down onto one knee, lowering himself to her level, his usually sharp blue eyes softening as he locked his gaze with hers, and with a steadiness that came not from wealth but from the promise of a man who had been changed, he said, "No, Olivia, from now on, you'll never fight alone again." Each word carrying the weight of a vow that was more binding than any contract he had ever signed, and Olivia's lips trembled before she threw her little arms around his neck, clinging to him as though she had finally found the anchor she had been praying for. And as he wrapped an arm around her tiny frame, his free hand reaching for Lily's frail fingers, he felt their warmth binding him in a way no possession ever had. The room fell into a hushed stillness, Grace pausing at the door with a softened, yet smile as if she understood she was witnessing the birth of something rare, a family forged not by blood, but by compassion, by a desperate cry that had reached into the cold heart of a man and remade it into something alive again. And Ethan, the billionaire once known for his icy resolve and ruthless drive, now knelt on a hospital floor, holding the hands of two fragile sisters, his chest swelling with a fierce protectiveness he had thought himself incapable of, whispering silently to himself that his life would never again return to the emptiness it once held, because he had been claimed not by wealth, not by power, but by the trust of a 6-year-old girl who had dared to believe he might come. And as the sunlight deepened in the room, wrapping them in its quiet blessing, Ethan realized that in answering Olivia's call, he had not only saved a life, he had saved his own.